Everything you believe you know right now, your name, the place where you find yourself, the fact that you are awake and not dreaming, rests on a trust you have never verified. You trust your eyes to show you the world as it is. You trust your memory to give back your past as it actually happened. You trust your reason to distinguish the true from the false. But what proves to you that this trust is deserved? What guarantees that everything you perceive at this very instant is not an illusion of such perfect coherence that you have no way of telling it apart from reality? One man asked this question. His name was René Descartes, and he asked it with such merciless rigor that he ended up doubting his own existence. And it was precisely at the bottom of that doubt that he found the only certainty that no one, in 4 centuries, has managed to destroy. In 1619, in a small room heated by a stove somewhere in Bavaria, a young man of 23 remains shut in for hours, motionless, without reading, without writing, simply thinking. Outside, all of Europe is sinking into what will become the 30 Years' War, one of the most destructive conflicts in the continent's history. Descartes is a soldier, enlisted in the army of Maximilian of Bavaria, but on this day he is not thinking about the war. He is thinking about certainty. That night, he has 3 dreams that will mark him for the rest of his life. Dreams he will interpret as a form of revelation, the indication of a mission, to entirely rebuild the edifice of human knowledge on foundations that could never again collapse. And what you are about to discover here goes far beyond the formula everyone knows without truly understanding it. Because I think, therefore I am, is not a conclusion, it is a starting point. And most people who quote this phrase have never followed the vertiginous path that leads to it, nor especially what comes after. That path passes through a doubt so radical it calls into question even mathematics itself, through the terrifying hypothesis of an all-powerful demon whose sole occupation would be to deceive us about everything, through proofs of the existence of God that have been attacked for 4 centuries without ever being totally refuted, and through a vision of the human being, an immaterial mind trapped inside a machine of flesh, whose consequences continue to haunt philosophy, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence to this day. But to understand all of this, you must first understand the world in which Descartes thought, a world where certainties were falling one after another, where men were still burned alive for daring to say the earth was not at the center of the universe, and where a single solitary mind, armed with nothing but his own reason, decided that since nothing was certain anymore, everything had to be started over from scratch. What few people know is that Descartes did not build his philosophy in the calm of a study. He built it in the midst of turmoil, in a world where religious certainties were crumbling under the blows of the wars of religion, where the astronomy of Copernicus was calling into question the Earth's place in the universe, where the authority of Aristotle, undisputed for 2,000 years, was beginning to crack under the discoveries of Galileo. Descartes belongs to a generation that watched the old world fall apart without a new one having yet been born. And faced with this void, he does not seek refuge in nostalgia for a lost order. He does something far more radical. He decides that since nothing is certain anymore, everything must be started over from scratch, like an architect who, discovering that the foundations of his house are cracked, prefers to demolish everything rather than patch up the building. This image is one Descartes uses himself. He compares inherited knowledge to an old building constructed by several generations of different architects, each adding a floor without checking whether the one below still held up. The result, he says, is a house that seems solid from the outside, but threatens to collapse at the slightest tremor. And this house is all of human knowledge inherited from antiquity and the Middle Ages. Aristotle's physics, scholastic theology, childhood prejudices, habits of thought transmitted without examination. Rebuilding this house is not enough. It must be raised. This is where the most radical intellectual adventure of the 17th century truly begins: methodical doubt. But be careful, there is something essential to understand before going any further, something that most superficial presentations of Descartes fail to mention. This doubt has nothing to do with lazy skepticism. The skeptics of antiquity, the Pyrrhonists, doubted everything on principle and stopped there, satisfied with their uncertainty, living in a form of perpetual suspension of judgment that paradoxically allowed them a certain peace of mind. Descartes does the opposite. He doubts not because he enjoys doubting, but precisely because he detests doubting. Doubt, for him, is a surgical instrument, used once, with controlled violence, and then definitively set aside. The point is not to live in doubt. The point is to pass through doubt in order to reach, on the other side, a bedrock on which to build, once and for all, an absolute certainty. And this doubt, to be truly effective, must be total. It is not enough to doubt what seems doubtful. One must doubt everything that is not absolutely, perfectly, indubitably certain, even if there is only a 1 in a million chance of it proving false. Why such an extreme demand? Because Descartes reasons like a jurist examining evidence. It is enough for a single testimony to be suspect, for the entire case to become fragile. In the same way, if a single belief in the entire edifice of knowledge turns out to be doubtful, then everything that follows from it becomes suspect. It is better, therefore, he says, to provisionally reject everything that contains the slightest ounce of uncertainty, rather than let a single false stone weaken the entire construction. This is where what are called the 3 waves of doubt come in, a progression that many popularizations skim over, even though it constitutes the beating heart of the entire Cartesian approach. The first wave is doubt concerning the senses. You may already know it. Our senses sometimes deceive us. A square tower can appear round from a distance. A stick plunged into water seems broken when it is not. A feverish person may see colors that do not exist. But Descartes quickly realizes that this first wave is too weak to found a universal doubt. For even if my senses sometimes deceive me about details, about nuances, about distant or tiny objects, it seems absurd to doubt that I am here, seated by the fire, wearing a dressing gown, a sheet of paper in my hands. These things my senses give me with such strong evidence that one would have to be mad to doubt them. And Descartes, with an honesty characteristic of him, refuses to compare himself to the mad. He therefore needs a more powerful reason to extend his doubt. This is where the second wave comes in, far more dizzying, the argument from dreaming. Descartes notices that when he dreams, he has exactly the same sensations as when he is awake. In the dream, he sees himself seated by the fire, he feels the heat, he touches the paper. Everything seems as real as it does now. Yet if there exists no absolutely certain criterion for distinguishing a dream from a waking state, how can he be sure, at this very moment, that he is not simply dreaming that he is seated by the fire philosophizing? This idea has crossed the centuries. It is found, barely transformed, in far later works of science fiction, where characters can no longer distinguish dream from reality, or simulation from the real world. What Descartes puts his finger on in the 17th century is exactly the problem that contemporary philosophers will call the brain in a vat problem, or more recently, the simulation hypothesis. If all of my sensory experience could be a coherent illusion, perfectly indistinguishable from reality, then no knowledge derived from the senses can claim absolute certainty. But even this second wave leaves one domain intact: mathematics. Whether I am dreaming or awake, 2 + 3 = 5. A square always has 4 sides. These truths seem to resist the doubt of the dream, because they do not depend on the existence of an external world, only on logical relations internal to the mind. It is to annihilate even this last fortress that Descartes deploys his third wave, the most radical, the most dizzying, the one that most quick summaries completely pass over in silence, the hypothesis of the evil genius. Descartes imagines the following: what if, instead of a good God, there existed an extremely powerful and cunning being, employing all his ingenuity to systematically deceive me, including about the simplest truths? What if, every time I calculate 2 plus 3, this evil genius manipulated my mind to make me believe the result is 5, when in reality it is not? This hypothesis is deliberately excessive, almost absurd, and Descartes knows it very well. He does not believe for a second in the actual existence of such a deceiving demon. But the excess is precisely the method. By pushing doubt to its most extreme breaking point, to the point of considering that even logic and mathematics could be an orchestrated illusion, Descartes seeks to know whether there remains, despite everything, something absolutely indubitable. And it is precisely at this moment of total vertigo, when nothing more seems able to resist, that the first certainty emerges. For here is the reasoning, in all its subtlety: even if this evil genius existed, even if he deceived me about absolutely everything, about my body, about the external world, about mathematics itself, there would remain one fact, that he could never make me doubt, the very fact that I am in the process of doubting. For to be deceived, one must exist. To doubt, one must think, and to think, one must be. Whether my thoughts are true or false, correct or deceived, is of no importance here. The simple fact that there is a thought unfolding, even if it is entirely erroneous, proves that there is a thinking subject who thinks it. It is this logical structure, and not a simple intuition, that leads to the formula everyone knows: I think, therefore I am. And it is precisely here that a nuance must be introduced that many people are unaware of. Contrary to what the French formula suggests, this is not a classical syllogism of the type, everything that thinks exists. Now I think, therefore I exist. Descartes insists in his replies to the objections that were addressed to him during his lifetime. The cogito is not a logical deduction from a general premise. It is an immediate intuition, an evidence grasped in a single glance of the mind, just as one instantly sees that a triangle has 3 sides without needing to demonstrate it through a multi-step argument. It is an act, not an argument. But this formula, however solid it may appear, has been attacked for nearly 4 centuries. And it would be dishonest to present it to you as an eternal and uncontested truth. The German philosopher Georg Christoph Lichtenberg, a century later, made a remark that has become famous among specialists. Descartes, he says, had no right to say, I think. He should only have said, it thinks, in the same way we say, it rains, without presupposing the existence of a specific subject behind the phenomenon. For the I that Descartes introduces is not given by the immediate experience of thought. It is an interpretation, a grammatical construction imposed on a phenomenon that, in itself, reveals only an activity of thought, not necessarily a substantial and permanent self behind that activity. Nietzsche would take up this critique with his characteristic ferocity, explaining that to say, I think, already presupposes enormously many undemonstrated things, that thought is an activity, that it needs an agent, that this agent is identical to the one who speaks. For Nietzsche, a thought comes when it wants, and not when I want it to, which already shatters the idea of a sovereign subject, master of its own thoughts. This critique is essential to understand because it reveals something. The cogito, however vertiginous it may be, proves only the existence of a thinking activity at the instant it occurs. It absolutely does not prove that this activity belongs to a stable, permanent self, identical through time. nor does it prove that this self is an immaterial soul, nor that it will continue to exist the following instant. All of this Descartes will have to construct through additional steps, and it is precisely here that his approach becomes philosophically the most fragile, the most contested, and yet the most fascinating to follow step by step. For once it is established that "I think, therefore I am" is indubitable, Descartes finds himself facing an immense problem. He has won a certainty, that of his own existence as a thinking being, but he finds himself as if locked inside his own mind, cut off from everything else, unable to know whether anything else really exists outside his thought. This is what will later be called, in the history of philosophy, the problem of solipsism. If all I am certain of is that I think, how can I ever escape my own consciousness to affirm the existence of an external world, of other minds, even of my own body? The solution Descartes proposes is audacious, and it is precisely the point where his philosophy tips over to the theological side, a point that most quick presentations completely sweep aside, even though it is absolutely central to the architecture of his system. Descartes notices that within himself, among all his ideas, he finds one that infinitely surpasses him, the idea of God, understood as an infinite, perfect, all-powerful being. Now, he says, an idea must have a cause that contains at least as much reality as what it represents. A finite and imperfect being like me cannot be the cause of an idea of infinity and perfection. That would be like claiming that an effect contains more reality than its cause, which is absurd. Therefore, this idea of God in me can only have been placed there by God himself. This is what is called the causal proof of the existence of God, developed in the third meditation. Descartes then adds a second proof, inherited from Anselm of Canterbury but reformulated in his own way, the ontological argument. If I conceive of God as a perfect being, and if existence is itself a perfection, then it is contradictory to conceive of a perfect God who would not exist, exactly as it would be contradictory to conceive of a triangle whose angles do not add up to 180 degrees. The existence of God, from this perspective, is deduced directly from his definition. These proofs were criticized almost immediately, including by contemporaries of Descartes themselves. The theologian Antoine Arnauld, in his objections published with the Meditations, points out a problem that has become famous under the name of the Cartesian circle. Descartes claims that we can be certain that what we conceive clearly and distinctly is true, because God, being perfect, could not deceive us. But to be certain that God exists and is not a deceiver, Descartes precisely needs to use the criterion of clarity and distinctness. In other words, he proves the reliability of clarity and distinctness through God, and he proves the existence of God through clarity and distinctness. It is a circle, a petitio principii. This weak point in the Cartesian architecture has never been totally resolved, and it continues to fuel debates among specialists to this day. But why does Descartes need God at this precise point in his reasoning? Because God, for him, plays the role of ultimate guarantor of truth. Once the existence of a perfect and non-deceiving God is established, Descartes can finally reintroduce trust in his faculties of knowledge. If God created me, and if God is not a deceiver by nature, then the faculties he gave me, my reason, my understanding, cannot be structurally designed to deceive me. The errors I commit come not from my faculties of knowledge themselves, but from a misuse of my freedom, when I rush to judge ideas that are not yet clear and distinct. It is a theory of error, entirely founded on the responsibility of the human will, and not on a deficiency of the understanding. It is only after having secured the existence of God that Descartes can finally return to the external world, to his own body, to the material reality he had bracketed since the beginning. And it is here that the most famous example in all his work after the Cogito comes in, the piece of wax. Descartes takes a piece of wax freshly removed from the hive. It has a smell of honey, a color, a shape, a certain hardness, a certain coldness. All these qualities are grasped by the senses. Then he brings this piece of wax near the fire. Almost instantly, the smell disappears, the color changes, the shape deforms, hardness becomes liquidity. All the sensible qualities that seem to define the wax have changed, and yet something tells us it is still the same wax. What then persists if none of the sensible qualities do? Descartes answers, what remains is the wax as flexible and changeable extension, a reality that one grasps not through the senses, nor even through the imagination, but through the understanding alone, through a purely intellectual inspection. This example is crucial, for it establishes a radical hierarchy between body and mind. The true knowledge of material things themselves passes through the mind, not the senses, thus overturning the entire epistemology inherited from Aristotle that placed the senses at the origin of all knowledge. This hierarchy leads to what the history of philosophy will remember under the name of Cartesian dualism. Descartes distinguishes two substances radically different in nature, the res cogitans, the thinking substance, whose essential attribute is to think, and which has neither extension, nor shape, nor location in space, and the res extensa, the extended substance, whose essential attribute is to occupy space, to have a shape, a position, a movement, but which does not think. The human body, for Descartes, is nothing other than an extraordinarily complex machine, comparable to the hydraulic automata that were installed at the time in royal gardens, statues capable of moving thanks to water pressure mechanisms. The heart is merely a pump, the nerves are tubes, the muscles are ropes. Nothing in this machine thinks. What thinks is something else, an immaterial substance lodged somewhere inside this machine. And it is precisely here that one of the most embarrassing problems in all of Cartesian philosophy arises, a problem that Descartes himself never managed to resolve satisfactorily. If the mind is immaterial, without extension, without spatial location, and if the body is purely material, how can these two substances of absolutely incompatible natures interact? How can an immaterial thought, the idea of raising one's arm, cause a purely physical movement in my muscles? And conversely, how can a pinprick, a purely mechanical phenomenon, cause a sensation of pain in a substance that, by definition, has no extension and therefore cannot be touched by anything material? Descartes proposes an answer that has always seemed unsatisfactory, even in his own time. He locates the point of interaction between soul and body in the pineal gland, a small structure at the center of the brain, which he chooses precisely because it is the only part of the brain that is not doubled into two symmetrical hemispheres, and which he therefore thinks suited to unifying perceptions into a single conscious experience. But this solution merely displaces the problem without solving it. To say that the interaction occurs in the pineal gland in no way explains how a substance without extension can act upon an extended substance, regardless of where one situates this point of contact. This weakness did not escape his contemporaries. The correspondence between Descartes and Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, one of the rare women philosophers of her era to have directly debated with him, puts its finger on this problem with formidable precision. In her letters, she asks Descartes how a soul, purely thinking and immaterial by definition, can have the capacity to determine the corporeal spirits to produce voluntary actions, when all determination of movement presupposes an impulse, a physical contact, an extension. Descartes never managed to respond in a fully convincing way to this objection, and he would end up admitting, in certain letters, that the union of soul and body is a primitive notion of human experience, something one lives without being able to fully explain it through pure reason, a rare admission from a philosopher who had built his entire method on the demand for absolute clarity. This dualism, as problematic as it may be, would nonetheless shape nearly 4 centuries of Western thought, and its influence extends far beyond the narrow circle of professional philosophers. It is Descartes who, first of all, separates matter from mind so sharply, opening the way to an entirely mechanistic physics, freed from all finality, from all vegetative or animal soul in the Aristotelian sense. Animals themselves, in Descartes, are reduced to the rank of pure machines devoid of consciousness, an extremely controversial thesis that would have considerable practical consequences. Certain scientists of the era, relying on this idea, would justify vivisection of animals without anesthesia by arguing that their cries of pain were merely reflex mechanisms with no real subjective experience behind them. This practical and ethical consequence of Cartesian dualism deserves mention, for it shows how an abstract philosophical idea can have concrete and sometimes terrible repercussions. The Cartesian legacy would split almost immediately into 2 great rival traditions. On one side, the continental rationalists, Spinoza and Leibniz notably, would take up the Cartesian demand to found knowledge on pure reason, while correcting what they considered the flaws of the system. Spinoza, in particular, would frontally reject the dualism of substances. For him, there can exist only one substance, infinite, which one can call God or nature indifferently, and of which thought and extension are merely 2 attributes among an infinity of others, 2 different ways of expressing the same unique reality. This critique is formidable, for it resolves at a stroke the problem of mind-body interaction that haunted Descartes. If thought and extension are merely 2 expressions of one and the same substance, there is no longer any need to explain how they interact, since they are never truly separated. On the other side of the philosophical spectrum, the British empiricists, Locke, Berkeley, then especially Hume, would attack Descartes on an entirely different front, that of the origin of knowledge. Locke would reject the idea of innate ideas present in us from birth, a notion Descartes used notably to explain the origin of the idea of God or of mathematical truths. For Locke, the mind at birth is a tabula rasa, a blank slate, and all knowledge derives entirely from sensory experience. Hume would go further still, and his is perhaps the most devastating critique ever addressed to the Cartesian cogito. When he introspects his own consciousness in search of a stable and permanent self, Hume claims to find only a discontinuous flux of perceptions, sensations, and emotions succeeding one another without any substantial self unifying them. The self for Hume is nothing more than a bundle of perceptions, a convenient fiction the mind tells itself to give a narrative coherence to what is in reality merely a succession without any true center. If Hume is right, then the Cartesian cogito proves only the momentary existence of an act of thought, but absolutely not the existence of a permanent, unified self identical through time, which ruins a great part of the metaphysical edifice Descartes wanted to build on this foundation. Kant, a century later, would attempt a synthesis between these 2 rival traditions, but he too would deliver a fundamental critique against Descartes, particularly against his proof of the existence of God. For Kant, existence is not a predicate, it is not a quality one can add to the concept of a thing as one adds a color or a size. To say that a thing exists adds nothing to its concept. It only affirms that this concept corresponds to something in reality. 100 real thalers in my pocket do not contain a penny more than 100 merely thought thalers. The difference is not in the concept, it is in the brute fact of existence, external to any definition. This critique, of formidable simplicity, demolishes the ontological argument Descartes had inherited from Anselm, by revealing that one can never extract existence from a mere analysis of concepts, however perfect they may be. It would, however, be profoundly unjust to reduce Descartes to a collection of errors identified after the fact by later philosophers. For beyond the flaws of his metaphysical system, Descartes bequeathed to humanity something immense, something that far exceeds the framework of academic philosophy, a method. The discourse on the method sets out 4 simple rules, almost self-evident today. So deeply have they permeated all of modern scientific culture, but which were revolutionary in their time. To accept as true only what presents itself to the mind clearly and distinctly, leaving no room for reasonable doubt. To divide each complex problem into as many simple parts as necessary to better solve it. To conduct one's thoughts from the simplest to the most complex, in order, and finally, to make enumerations so complete and reviews so general as to be assured of omitting nothing. This method, systematically applied, became the very foundation of what would later be called the modern scientific method, far beyond the strictly philosophical field. Descartes himself would apply it with remarkable success in mathematics, by inventing analytic geometry, the system that allows geometric figures to be represented by algebraic equations, a fusion of 2 previously separate domains, which still bears his name today through what are called Cartesian coordinates. In the 20th century, another philosophical tradition, phenomenology, would take up the Cartesian project while overturning it from the inside. Edmund Husserl explicitly claims the legacy of Descartes in his Cartesian meditations, himself seeking an absolute certainty from which to reconstruct all knowledge. But he would criticize Descartes for having moved too quickly from the cogito to the assertion of a thinking substance isolated from the world. For Husserl, consciousness is never a pure inward gaze cut off from all objects. It is always intentional, that is, always consciousness of something, always turned toward a world that it can never entirely bracket without contradicting itself. But the most frontal critique against Cartesian dualism will arguably come from Maurice Merleau-Ponty in his Phenomenology of Perception. For Merleau-Ponty, the fundamental error of Descartes is to have conceived of the body as a simple object among other objects in the world, a machine that the mind would inhabit from the outside, like a pilot in his vessel, to use an image Descartes himself employs. Yet, says Merleau-Ponty, my body is never a simple object for me. It is through it, and not despite it, that I have an originary access to the world. I do not think of my body as an external thing I manipulate from a distance. I am my body, or more precisely, I am a being in the world, incarnate, for whom the separation between pure thought and pure matter simply has no meaning in actual lived experience. When I reach my hand toward a cup of coffee, there is not first a disembodied thought that gives an order, then a bodily mechanism that executes it. There is a single, unified, intentional, incarnate gesture that entirely escapes the Cartesian dichotomy between thinking substance and extended substance. This critique finds a surprising echo in contemporary neuroscience. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio titled one of his most influential works, Descartes' Error, precisely to denounce the idea of a pure reason, detached from the body and from emotions, capable of functioning autonomously like a disembodied logical machine. Damasio's research on patients who have suffered lesions in certain brain regions linked to the processing of emotions shows something initially counterintuitive. These patients, who nonetheless retain intact logical reasoning capacities, often become incapable of making rational decisions in their daily lives. Without the emotional signals that orient and prioritize our choices, pure logical reason, left to itself, finds itself paralyzed before the infinity of possibilities, unable to decide. What these discoveries suggest is that reason and emotion, far from being two separable faculties as Cartesian dualism implicitly held, are in reality deeply intertwined in the human brain, to the point that one cannot remove one without damaging the other. There is also a dimension that traditional presentations of Descartes almost systematically omit, even though it has taken on considerable importance in more recent rereadings of his work, the dimension of gender. Feminist philosophers, notably Genevieve Lloyd in her work on reason and masculinity in Western philosophy, have shown how the Cartesian thinking subject, presented as neutral and universal, was in reality historically constructed by excluding the body, the emotions, and by extension everything that was culturally associated with the feminine in the thought of the era. The pure, disembodied Cartesian subject, master of himself through the sole force of his reason, long served as an implicit model for a conception of rationality that devalued everything pertaining to affectivity, the body, and care, dimensions now recognized as essential to a complete and unmutilated human intelligence. So what truly remains of Descartes today, once we have traversed all these critiques, all these objections accumulated over nearly 400 years? What remains, first, is a gesture, that of daring to suspend all one's inherited beliefs in order to verify, for oneself, what truly withstands examination. This gesture you can reproduce today, on your own scale, with your own beliefs, your own certainties inherited from your education, from the ambient culture, from opinions that circulate without ever being questioned. What also remains is a more subtle lesson, almost running counter to Descartes' original intention, that the absolute certainty he sought may exist nowhere, neither in the senses nor even in pure thought, and that true philosophical courage may not be to find an unshakable bedrock once and for all, but to learn to think with rigor within uncertainty itself, without ever ceasing to question, including the foundations one believed to be most solid. Descartes wanted to build a definitive edifice. What his work actually produced, through the critiques it provoked over 4 centuries, is a far more precious lesson still, that no system, however rigorous, entirely escapes the necessity of being itself, in turn called into doubt. But before going further into this critical rereading, we must go back and recount what Descartes actually did with his life, once doubt had been traversed, once the cogito had been established. Because Descartes was not merely a man who thought in a room heated by a stove, he was a man in permanent flight, a voluntary exile, a mind so mistrustful of the institutions of his time that he spent the better part of his adult life far from the France that had seen his birth. After his years of training with the Jesuits at La Flèche, where he received a classical education founded on Aristotelian logic and scholastic theology, precisely what he would later reject, Descartes traveled across Europe for nearly a decade, enlisting successively in several armies, not out of warlike conviction, but because the military life of the era, consisting of long periods of inactivity between campaigns, left him considerable time to observe men, customs, the manners of different countries, and above all to think. He would say himself that he wanted to travel in order to be a spectator, rather than an actor, in all the comedies played on the world's stage, a phrase that says much about the distance he always maintained between himself and the agitations of his era. In 1628, after what he considered the revelation of his method, Descartes made a crucial decision. He left France definitively to settle in the United Provinces, the Dutch Republic, then one of the few places in Europe where freedom of thought and publication was relatively tolerated compared to Catholic France or inquisitorial Spain. He would remain there for more than 20 years, ceaselessly moving from one city to another, changing address some 30 times, partly to preserve his peace of mind against unwanted visitors, partly out of mistrust toward the local religious authorities, Calvinist this time, who would not always prove more tolerant than the Catholic Church toward his ideas. And it is precisely in Holland in 1633 that the episode occurs which would radically change Descartes' publication strategy, and which largely explains the extreme caution he would display for the rest of his career. He completes a treatise entitled The World, in which he explicitly defends the heliocentric system of Copernicus, the idea that the Earth revolves around the Sun and not the other way around. But at the very moment he is about to publish it, he learns that Galileo has just been condemned by the Holy Office in Rome, precisely for having supported this same heliocentric thesis, and publicly compelled to abjure his astronomical convictions under threat of torture. Descartes, terrified at the idea of suffering a similar fate, immediately abandons the publication of his work. He writes to a friend that this news surprised him so much that he nearly burned all his papers, or at least resolved to show them to no one. This moment is crucial for understanding the Descartes who follows. He is no longer merely a philosopher of methodical doubt. He is henceforth a strategist of prudence, someone who will learn to distill his most dangerous ideas with infinite rhetorical precautions, multiplying declarations of submission to the authority of the Church, while slipping, between the lines, ideas profoundly subversive for his era. This prudence would not, however, protect him entirely. His works would be placed on the Index of Forbidden Books by the Catholic Church in 1663, 13 years after his death, and the teaching of his philosophy would even be explicitly forbidden in several French universities for decades. So much did the religious and academic authorities fear that this method of doubt, once popularized, would end up turning against the religious dogmas themselves, despite all the precautions Descartes had taken to prove the existence of God and safeguard the immortality of the soul. Descartes would end his life in an almost tragic manner, far from the relative freedom he had found in Holland. In 1649, Queen Christina of Sweden, an exceptionally cultivated monarch who corresponded with the greatest minds of Europe, invited him to her court in Stockholm to teach her philosophy personally. Descartes, reluctant, eventually accepted, seduced by the idea of converting a powerful queen to the virtues of his method. But the queen, accustomed to rising at dawn for her activities, demanded that the philosophy lessons take place at 5 o'clock in the morning, in a freezing library of the royal palace, in the depths of the Swedish winter. Descartes, who had throughout his life made a habit of staying in bed until 11 in the morning, considering that it was in this semi-wakeful state that his mind produced its best reflections, found himself compelled to completely overturn his way of life. A few months after his arrival in Stockholm, in February 1650, he contracted pneumonia and died, at the age of 53, in that frozen country that was not his own, far from France, far even from the Holland that had welcomed him for 20 years. There is something ironic, almost cruel, in the fact that the man who had devoted his life to separating mind from body, to demonstrating that thought could subsist independently of matter, was ultimately carried off by the most elementary fragility of his bodily envelope, the victim of a simple change of schedule and a climate too harsh for his constitution. Let us now return to the method itself, and in particular to an aspect that most presentations skim over entirely, the provisional morality. We mentioned it briefly earlier, but it deserves a far more extensive treatment, for it reveals a Descartes far more pragmatic, far less radical in his daily life than the violence of his methodical doubt would suggest. Descartes understands something essential. During the entire time necessary to reconstruct the edifice of knowledge on certain foundations, a process that may take years, even a lifetime, one must continue to act, to make concrete decisions in the real world. One cannot indefinitely suspend all action while waiting to have achieved absolute certainty about everything. That would be like a man who, having his house rebuilt, refused to have a provisional shelter during the works, on the pretext that this shelter would not be the final version of his dwelling. Descartes therefore establishes 4 provisional maxims, 4 rules of practical conduct that he commits to following for the duration of his philosophical reconstruction. The first maxim consists in obeying the laws and customs of one's country, retaining the religion in which one was raised, and governing oneself by the most moderate opinions of those with whom one will have to live. What strikes one here is the extreme social prudence of Descartes, the man who dares intellectually to doubt everything, in the silence of his study, deliberately chooses to conform outwardly to the social and religious norms of his time, refusing all radicalism in concrete action. He even specifies that he prefers to follow the most moderate opinions, because these are always the most convenient in practice, and probably the best, all excess being generally bad. The second maxim concerns firmness in action. Once a decision has been made, even on uncertain grounds, one must hold to it with constancy, like a traveler lost in a forest who, not knowing which direction is the right one, would do better to walk always straight in the same direction, rather than wander about changing course constantly, for he will at least end up emerging from the forest on one side or another, whereas perpetual hesitation would condemn him to going in circles indefinitely. This image of the lost traveler is particularly telling. It shows that for Descartes, practical action cannot wait for absolute theoretical certainty, and that firmness in execution sometimes matters more than initial certainty of choice. The third maxim is perhaps the most stoic of all. Descartes resolves always to try to conquer himself rather than fortune, and to change his desires rather than the order of the world. In other words, rather than seeking to alter external circumstances that do not entirely depend on us, it is better to adjust our own expectations and desires to what is actually within our power. This idea, directly inherited from ancient Stoics such as Epictetus, would allow Descartes to maintain a form of inner serenity despite the political and religious storms agitating his era. The fourth maxim, finally, consists in devoting one's entire life to cultivating one's reason and advancing as far as possible in the knowledge of truth, following the method one has prescribed for oneself. It is this last maxim that justifies and encompasses all the rest. The first 3 practical rules are merely temporary safeguards, allowing Descartes to live in society without friction while he pursues, in private, in the silence of his studies, the great enterprise of reconstructing knowledge. This provisional morality reveals something essential about the true nature of the Cartesian project. It is absolutely not a program of revolutionary life designed to overturn the existing social order. Descartes is, in his outward life, a prudent, almost timid conformist, while in his inner life he is the author of the most radical philosophical gesture of his century. This tension between social prudence and intellectual audacity runs through his entire existence, and it largely explains why he was able to pursue his research for several decades without suffering the fate of Galileo or of Giordano Bruno, burned alive a few decades earlier for cosmological theses that were otherwise less subversive. There is another part of the Cartesian oeuvre almost entirely unknown to the general public, even though it constitutes in reality the last great work published during his lifetime, and perhaps the most surprising: The Passions of the Soul. Published in 1649, 1 year before his death, one might expect, from the man who had so radically separated pure thought from matter, a treatise disdaining the emotions as mere bodily disturbances of no philosophical interest. Quite the opposite occurs. Descartes devotes meticulous, almost scientific attention to the mechanics of human emotions, seeking to understand precisely how the union of soul and body, that mystery he had never managed to resolve theoretically, manifests itself concretely in our affective life. Descartes identifies 6 primitive passions, from which all other human emotions can, according to him, be derived by combination: wonder, love, hatred, desire, joy, and sadness. Wonder occupies a particularly fascinating place in his classification. Unlike the 5 other passions, it does not concern the good or evil of an object for us, but simply its novelty, the fact that it surprises us by its rarity or strangeness. Descartes goes so far as to suggest that it is wonder, this capacity to be seized by the novelty of a thing, that constitutes the primary motor of all scientific and philosophical investigation. Without this capacity to be astonished by what falls outside the ordinary, no search for truth would ever be undertaken. There is something profoundly coherent, when one thinks about it, between this theory of wonder and the initial gesture of methodical doubt. Both spring from the same disposition of mind, the one that refuses to take as settled and obvious what habit presents to us as banal. This treatise on the passions reveals a far more nuanced Descartes than the caricatural image, sometimes peddled, of the cold, purely rationalist philosopher cut off from all sensibility. He explicitly affirms that the passions, well directed by reason, are not enemies of wisdom but can, on the contrary, contribute to it, and that the true objective is not to suppress emotions, as the Stoics in their most extreme form advocated, but to learn to master them and orient them toward the good, by cultivating what he calls generosity, a virtue that combines self-esteem founded on the just use of one's freedom and an equivalent respect accorded to that same freedom. We must now leap forward 3 centuries to understand how the 20th century would reinterpret, in its own way, the Cartesian legacy, particularly around the question of freedom. Jean-Paul Sartre, in Being and Nothingness, would take up part of the Cartesian gesture while radicalizing it in a direction Descartes himself would probably never have envisaged. For Sartre, consciousness, exactly as in Descartes, reveals itself to itself in an immediate and indubitable manner. But where Descartes saw in this consciousness a stable substance, the res cogitans, endowed with a fixed and permanent nature, Sartre affirms, on the contrary, that consciousness is nothing but a pure nothingness, a void that ceaselessly projects itself toward its own future possibilities, without ever totally coinciding with itself. This difference may seem technical, almost anecdotal, but it has considerable existential consequences. If Descartes thinks of a substantial and permanent self, Sartre draws from it instead the famous idea that existence precedes essence, that man has no fixed nature determining in advance what he must be, and that he is therefore condemned to be free, to create himself at every instant through his choices, without any stable foundation to cling to. One could say, simplifying to the extreme, that Sartre takes the Cartesian cogito and removes from it precisely what Descartes had added that was most reassuring: the stability of a permanent substance. This Sartrean existential anguish finds a troubling echo in another rereading of Cartesianism, far more contemporary this time, coming from the cognitive sciences and analytic philosophy of mind. The philosopher Gilbert Ryle, in his work The Concept of Mind, published in 1949, coins an expression that has remained famous for ridiculing Cartesian dualism. He speaks of the ghost in the machine, to describe the image of an immaterial mind lodged somewhere inside a mechanical body, like a small invisible pilot at the controls of a physical vessel. For Ryle, this image rests on what he calls a category mistake. It is as if someone, after having visited all the faculties, all the laboratories, all the libraries of a university, then asked where the university itself could be found, as if it were an additional building, distinct from all those he had already been shown. In the same way, to seek the mind as a thing distinct and separate from observable behavior and bodily processes is to commit a fundamental logical confusion between different levels of description of one and the same reality. This critique would directly nourish the emergence, in the second half of the 20th century, of the functionalist current in philosophy of mind, a school of thought that would profoundly influence, in turn, the development of cognitive sciences and nascent artificial intelligence. For the functionalists, what defines a mental state is neither its precise material composition, contrary to reductive materialism, nor a separate immaterial substance, contrary to Cartesian dualism, but its functional role, the way it is situated between sensory inputs, behavioral outputs, and other mental states. This conception would have a considerable philosophical consequence. If a mental state is defined solely by its function and not by its substance, then it becomes in principle conceivable that an entirely different system from the biological human brain, a computer system for instance, could in principle realize the same functions and therefore potentially produce mental states comparable to our own. This is precisely the question posed, as early as 1950, by the mathematician Alan Turing, with his famous test, can one, through conversation alone, reliably distinguish a machine from an authentically thinking human being? And this question is itself never, at bottom, anything other than a modern, technological reformulation of the old Cartesian problem of the evil genius. How can one know with certainty, from the outside, whether an entity truly thinks or merely simulates, with sufficient perfection, the appearance of thought? The vertigo is almost identical 4 centuries apart. Descartes wondered how to be certain that his own mind was not being deceived by a perfectly coherent illusion. Contemporary philosophers of artificial intelligence today wonder how to be certain that a system, however sophisticated in its responses, truly possesses an inner consciousness and is not merely simulating, in a functionally indiscernible way, all the outward signs of that consciousness. The Australian philosopher David Chalmers has even given a learned name to this old Cartesian problem, calling it the hard problem of consciousness. One can, in principle, entirely explain the functioning of a brain in purely physical and functional terms, without this explaining why there exists, in addition to this functioning, a subjective experience lived from the inside, what is technically called qualia. This problem, in a different form but in its deepest essence, is very precisely the one Descartes was already confronting in 1641, when he sought to understand why and how a thinking substance could be united to a corporeal machine without ever totally merging with it. We must pause a moment on the figure of Elizabeth of Bohemia herself, for to reduce her to a mere correspondent who raised a technical objection would be profoundly unjust to her. A princess in exile, granddaughter of James I of England, she had fled with her family after her father's defeat in the early years of the 30 Years' War, and was living, at the time of her correspondence with Descartes, in precarious material circumstances, surrounded by brothers and sisters scattered across Europe by the fortunes of war. Descartes himself would acknowledge in his letters the exceptional quality of her mind, going so far as to dedicate the Principles of Philosophy, one of his major works, to her, in terms of intellectual deference rare for the era, when women were almost systematically excluded from learned circles. But beyond the technical question of the interaction problem, Elizabeth pushes Descartes toward terrain he had not anticipated, that of practical wisdom in the face of adversity. In several letters she questions him about how to live with illness, with grief, with reversals of fortune, forcing the philosopher of methodical doubt to descend from his abstract metaphysical considerations toward far more concrete questions about the art of living well, which would contribute directly to the writing of The Passions of the Soul. There is thus a collaborative dimension, almost a reversed Socratic dialogue, in the genesis of this last great Cartesian work. It was not Descartes alone, shut away in his study, who conceived it, but a princess in exile who pushed him to leave the terrain of pure speculation and confront truly real existential questions. We must also return to the materialist critique that Thomas Hobbes addresses to Descartes, a critique that contrasts sharply with Spinoza's, mentioned earlier, because it attacks the Cartesian system from an almost opposite direction. Where Spinoza reproaches Descartes for having multiplied substances when one alone suffices, Hobbes, in his objections published with the Meditations, goes much further still. For him, there simply exists no immaterial substance whatsoever, neither in God nor in man. Everything that exists is corporeal, including what we call thought, which is never, according to Hobbes, anything but a particular movement of matter inside the brain, exactly as digestion is a movement of matter inside the stomach. When Descartes asserts that the cogito proves the existence of a thinking substance distinct from the body, Hobbes retorts that he commits an elementary confusion. From the fact that I think, one can only conclude that there exists something that thinks, but nothing authorizes the conclusion that this thing must be immaterial rather than corporeal. This reasoning, marginal at the time and considered dangerously materialist, very precisely prefigures the positions defended today by many materialist philosophers and neuroscientists, for whom consciousness is nothing other than a purely physical process occurring in the brain, without any need to posit any additional immaterial substance. This quarrel between Hobbes and Descartes reveals, by contrast, just how much the 17th century was an absolutely decisive tipping point, where three great metaphysical options found themselves in direct competition for the centuries to come: Cartesian dualism, which maintains two distinct substances, the materialist monism of Hobbes, for whom everything is matter, and Spinozist monism, for whom there exists only one substance having at least two attributes, thought and extension, without either ever being reducible to the other. This philosophical trifurcation, born in the same decades, continues to structure, in obviously renewed forms, the essential debates of contemporary philosophy of mind. Let us return, to conclude this critical exploration, to the example of the piece of wax, because it deserves an extension that traditional commentaries often leave aside, its epistemological reach for science itself. In affirming that the true nature of wax is not found in its changing sensible qualities, color, smell, texture, but in an underlying geometric reality, a flexible and measurable extension, Descartes in reality lays the philosophical foundations for all the mathematized physics that would follow. It is this Cartesian conviction that the material world must be understood through measurable magnitudes rather than through immediate sensible impressions that would allow modern physics to treat matter as a set of quantifiable relations, mass, velocity, position, rather than as a set of experienced qualities like felt warmth or perceived color. The epistemologist Gaston Bachelard would later describe this type of rupture as an epistemological break necessary for all genuine scientific progress. Science never progresses through the simple accumulation of sensible observations, but through a violent rupture with the immediate evidence of the senses. Exactly the gesture Descartes performs with his piece of wax. In this sense, long before later criticisms came to undermine his metaphysics of the thinking subject, Descartes had already changed forever the way Western civilization would conceive of matter itself, by emptying it of all sensible quality to retain only measurement. And this is perhaps, at bottom, the most dizzying paradox of the entire Cartesian legacy. The man who wanted to prove with absolute certainty the existence of God and the immortality of the soul, the man profoundly inhabited by a sincere piety, ended up furnishing the most powerful conceptual tools to a modern science that would, a few generations later, construct itself ever more independently of any theological reference, to the point of emancipating itself from it almost entirely. The Cartesian gesture of doubt, originally conceived as a simple transitional step toward a definitive truth, revealed itself, in the hands of his most critical heirs, to be a tool far more subversive than Descartes himself had imagined, capable of turning against the religious certainties he had originally wished to preserve and sanctuarize. There remains, finally, one last dimension of the Cartesian legacy that it would be a shame not to explore, for it directly concerns the way we navigate today in a world saturated with information, the question of intellectual authority. Descartes breaks frontally with a principle that dominated all medieval thought, the argument from authority, the idea that a claim becomes true, or at least credible, simply because it was formulated by a recognized thinker, Aristotle first among them, whose treatises still held undisputed authority nearly 2,000 years after their composition. In the universities of the 17th century, Aristotelian physics was still taught not because it had been experimentally verified, but because Aristotle had written it, and the scholastic tradition had sacralized his authority to the point of rendering it almost untouchable. Descartes, by positing as a principle that no opinion, however venerable and ancient, deserves to be believed without personal examination, deals a fatal blow to this principle of authority, opening the way to a conception of knowledge where it is individual verification and not reverence toward a prestigious source that must ground belief. This rupture comes at a price, which Descartes fully assumes. It is profoundly individualist, almost solitary. The Cartesian subject who methodically doubts does so alone, isolated in his study, without the help of any tradition, any community of scholars, any master thinker. This is a considerable difference from the approach of Aristotle himself, for whom knowledge was always built in dialogue with received opinions, the endoxa, which had to be examined, sorted, criticized, but never entirely bracketed as Descartes does at the moment of hyperbolic doubt. This methodological solitude of the Cartesian subject has often been criticized, notably by more recent philosophers attached to a more communal and dialogical conception of knowledge, for whom truth is always elaborated collectively, through reasoned exchange between several minds, and not in the isolation of a single consciousness facing itself. And yet this Cartesian demand for individual verification, however solitary in its original form, retains a striking relevance in our era, for reasons Descartes himself could never have anticipated. We live in a world where authority, in the old sense of the word, has fragmented into a multitude of competing voices, where any claim can circulate instantly on a planetary scale, clothed in an appearance of credibility that is sometimes entirely usurped, where entirely fabricated content, images, videos, texts, can imitate with formidable fidelity the outward signs of authenticity. In this context, the fundamental Cartesian gesture, the one that consists in suspending one's assent before any claim that has not been personally examined with rigor, recovers an almost vertiginous timeliness. Not that one should, as the evil genius imagined hyperbolically, doubt absolutely everything to the point of sinking into total paralysis, Descartes himself refusing this paralyzing extremity thanks to his provisional morality. But that one must cultivate, daily, this capacity to distinguish what has been verified from what has merely been repeated, what withstands critical examination from what holds only by the force of its viral spread. It is therefore not so much the metaphysical conclusions of Descartes that should be retained today, most of them having been seriously shaken by nearly 4 centuries of accumulated critiques, from Hobbes to Chalmers by way of Hume, Kant, Nietzsche, and Merleau-Ponty, but rather the gesture itself, that initial movement of suspension of judgment, followed by a patient reconstruction, stone by stone, from what truly withstands examination. A gesture that, paradoxically, must today be applied to Descartes himself. One must doubt Cartesian dualism as one would doubt any other inherited assertion, examine it in the light of everything philosophy and the cognitive sciences have discovered since, and retain from his edifice only what, 4 centuries later, effectively continues to hold. So, at the end of this long journey through the certainties, doubts, critiques, and contemporary resonances of Cartesian thought, one question remains, and it is perhaps the most important of all. What should we concretely retain from Descartes today, in an era saturated with contradictory information, where it becomes ever more difficult to distinguish a reliable source from a sophisticated manipulation, where artificially generated content can imitate with disturbing precision the voice, the writing, or even the reasoning of a real human being? Perhaps precisely this, the capacity to suspend one's judgment, to refuse to accept information simply because it circulates widely or because it comes from a source that seems authoritative, and to seek, patiently, methodically, what truly withstands the most rigorous examination one can apply to it. It is no accident that, 4 centuries after his death in the cold of Stockholm, Descartes' method continues to haunt every discipline that claims to seek truth. Not because he found all the answers, most of his metaphysical conclusions having since been seriously shaken, but because he posed, with a clarity and an intensity never equaled since, the question that precedes all others: on what, exactly, do I have the right to found my certainty?